Daniel was the kind of person everyone trusted, everyone relied on, everyone praised. If someone needed help, he was there before they even finished asking. If someone was hurting, he listened quietly and absorbed their pain as if it were his responsibility to fix it. People often said, "You're such a good person," and he nodded with a polite smile, but deep inside, he felt strangely invisible. His days were full, yet his heart felt empty, like a house where the lights were always on but no one truly lived inside. From a young age, Daniel had learned a simple rule: love must be earned. When he behaved well, stayed quiet, helped others, and never complained, he received approval. When he needed something for himself, the room grew cold. So he adapted. He became the boy who never caused trouble, then the man who never said no. He believed that if he gave enough, sacrificed enough, people would stay. And staying, he thought, meant love. As the years passed, his life became a long list of obligations. He worked late not because he wanted to, but because he didn't want to disappoint. He answered calls at midnight, listened to endless complaints, and fixed problems that were never his to solve. He postponed his own dreams, telling himself there would be time later. Yet later never came. Every time he felt exhausted, he reminded himself that being needed was better than being alone. One evening, after a particularly long day, Daniel sat alone in his apartment. The silence felt heavy. His phone buzzed again, another request, another crisis that wasn't truly an emergency. He stared at the screen and felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was a deep, quiet realization that he was tired of abandoning himself. His reflection in the dark screen startled him. He looked older than he felt, his eyes dull, his expression worn down by years of self-neglect. He tried to remember the last time he did something purely for himself. Not to impress anyone. Not to help anyone. Just because it made him feel alive. The memory didn't come. That absence hurt more than any insult ever had. For the first time, he wondered if constantly being available was slowly destroying him. The next day, when another request came in, Daniel hesitated. His heart raced. His mind filled with fear. He imagined people being upset, disappointed, maybe even leaving his life. Still, he typed a short message saying he couldn't help this time. As soon as he sent it, guilt washed over him like a wave. His hands trembled. He felt selfish, cruel, ungrateful. He waited for the backlash, convinced he had just ruined everything. What followed was silence. Not concern. Not understanding. Just distance. Some people never replied again. Others responded coldly. A few tried to remind him of all he owed them. Each reaction cut deeply, but with every cut, the truth became clearer. The love he had been holding onto was conditional. It existed only as long as he kept sacrificing himself. One night, overwhelmed by the weight of this realization, Daniel broke down. Sitting on the floor of his apartment, he cried not because people were leaving, but because he finally saw how little space he had ever allowed himself to exist. He had been so busy keeping everyone else comfortable that he never asked what he needed. That night, through tears and exhaustion, he made a quiet promise to himself. He would stop treating his own life as an afterthought. Loving himself didn't feel natural at first. Saying no made his chest tight. Resting made him feel lazy. Choosing himself felt like betrayal. But slowly, he began to notice small changes. He slept better. He felt lighter. He started doing things he once loved, without explaining or justifying them to anyone. For the first time, he listened to his own voice instead of silencing it. As weeks turned into months, Daniel noticed something surprising. The world didn't collapse because he set boundaries. The sky didn't fall because he stopped overgiving. Life simply continued. Some people faded away completely, and though it hurt, it also brought relief. Others stayed, but now they treated him differently. With respect. With understanding. With genuine care. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, Daniel saw himself clearly. Not as a tool for others, not as a source of endless sacrifice, but as a human being deserving of kindness, rest, and respect. He realized that loving himself wasn't about becoming cold or distant. It was about refusing to abandon himself just to be accepted. In that moment, Daniel understood a truth that changed everything. When you love yourself above everyone, you don't become selfish. You become whole. You stop begging for love and start living in truth. And the people who truly belong in your life will never ask you to disappear just to keep them comfortable. Daniel began to notice how deeply his old habits were rooted in his body. Even on days when no one asked him for anything, he felt restless, as if he were forgetting an important duty. His mind kept searching for someone else's problem to solve, someone else's burden to carry. It was uncomfortable to sit with himself. Silence felt unfamiliar, almost threatening, because for years he had filled every quiet moment by being useful to others. He realized that his kindness had slowly turned into a shield. As long as he was helping, no one questioned him. As long as he was available, no one looked too closely at who he really was. Loving himself meant removing that shield and standing exposed, without guarantees. That terrified him. Yet something inside him knew there was no other way forward. There were days when guilt returned stronger than before. He would replay old conversations in his head, wondering if he should have done more, given more, sacrificed again. On those days, he reminded himself of how empty he used to feel at night, how exhausted his soul had been. He wrote down everything he had ignored about himself, his dreams, his limits, his need for peace. Seeing it on paper made it real. It wasn't weakness. It was honesty. Slowly, Daniel started rebuilding his life from the inside out. He stopped explaining his boundaries. He learned that no did not need an apology. When someone reacted badly, he resisted the urge to fix their feelings. That was not his job anymore. This was one of the hardest lessons. Other people's disappointment did not mean he was doing something wrong. With time, he noticed how differently he moved through the world. His steps felt lighter. His breath deeper. Conversations changed too. He spoke more slowly, more honestly. He stopped laughing at things that hurt him just to keep the peace. Some people found this new version of him uncomfortable. They preferred the old Daniel. The quiet, giving, endlessly accommodating one. But he no longer shrank himself to fit their expectations. There were moments of loneliness, moments when he missed the constant noise of being needed. But even loneliness felt cleaner than the quiet resentment he used to carry. He began to enjoy his own company. He read books without rushing. He took walks without headphones. He allowed himself to feel joy without guilt, rest without fear. One afternoon, an old friend reached out, upset that Daniel had changed. The word stung, but instead of defending himself, Daniel listened calmly. When the call ended, he felt sadness, not anger. Change often feels like loss to those who benefited from your silence. He understood that now. And understanding gave him peace. Over time, new connections entered his life, people who didn't demand his exhaustion as proof of love. With them, conversations felt balanced. Care flowed both ways. For the first time, Daniel experienced what mutual respect felt like. It was quiet, steady, and safe. No performance required. Late one evening, Daniel sat by the window watching the city lights. He thought about the years he spent chasing approval, mistaking self-neglect for kindness. He didn't feel regret, only compassion for the version of himself who didn't know any better. That version had survived the only way he knew how. Now, Daniel knew something different. Loving yourself above everyone does not mean pushing people away. It means refusing to disappear for them. It means choosing truth over comfort, peace over approval, wholeness over constant sacrifice. As he closed his eyes that night, he felt something he had never truly felt before, a quiet, steady sense of belonging. Not to others. Not to expectations. But to himself. Daniel's relationship with himself continued to evolve in subtle but powerful ways. He began to notice how often he used to apologize for simply existing. Sorry for bothering you. Sorry for taking your time. Sorry, it's not a big deal. Those words had once come out of his mouth automatically, as if his presence itself required permission. Now, every time he caught himself about to say sorry for no real reason, he paused. He replaced it with silence, or with honesty. It felt strange at first, like walking without a familiar weight on his back. He also started paying attention to his emotions instead of suppressing them. In the past, whenever he felt anger or sadness, he would immediately bury it, telling himself others had it worse. Now, he allowed those feelings to exist without judgment. He learned that emotions were not enemies to be defeated but signals to be understood. When something hurt, he acknowledged it. When something drained him, he stepped back. This simple awareness slowly rebuilt a trust he had never had with himself. There were setbacks, of course. Some days he slipped back into old patterns, overgiving, over-explaining, overextending. When that happened, he no longer punished himself. He gently reminded himself that unlearning takes time. Growth is not loud or dramatic, it is quiet, repetitive, and often uncomfortable. Each time he chose himself, even in the smallest way, it strengthened something inside him. Daniel also realized how much of his identity had been tied to being the good one. The reliable one. The selfless one. Letting go of that identity felt like losing a part of himself. But in its place, something more real began to form. He discovered interests he had ignored for years. He explored ideas without worrying whether they would be useful to others. He allowed himself to dream again, not with urgency, but with curiosity. One evening, as he reflected on his journey, Daniel understood that loving himself didn't mean he stopped caring about others. It meant he stopped using self-destruction as a form of kindness. True care, he realized, does not require you to bleed. Real love does not ask you to disappear. The people who truly mattered never needed him to be exhausted to prove his worth. As time passed, Daniel became more comfortable with being misunderstood. Not everyone needed to agree with his choices. Not everyone needed to like him. This acceptance brought a freedom he had never known. He no longer chased validation because he no longer doubted his own value. He had learned to sit with himself, to trust himself, to choose himself even when it felt uncomfortable. On a quiet morning, Daniel stood outside watching the sunrise. The world felt calm, and so did he. He realized that loving yourself above everyone is not a destination you reach once and forever. It is a daily choice. A promise you make to yourself again and again. And for the first time, Daniel was ready to keep that promise, no matter who walked away, because he finally understood that abandoning himself was the one loss he could never afford again. Daniel began to understand that loving himself was not a single decision but a long conversation he had to keep having with his own heart. Some mornings he woke up feeling strong and clear, grounded in his choices. Other mornings he woke up with an old heaviness pressing on his chest, the familiar urge to please, to explain himself, to make sure everyone else was comfortable before he allowed himself peace. Instead of fighting those mornings, he learned to meet them gently. He would sit quietly, breathe, and remind himself that healing does not erase the past, it teaches you how to live with it without letting it control you. He noticed how deeply he had been trained to measure his worth by other people's reactions. A smile meant approval. Silence meant danger. Disappointment felt like failure. Slowly, he started breaking that pattern. When someone seemed distant, he no longer rushed to fix it. When someone misunderstood him, he resisted the urge to correct every detail. He let people have their feelings, even when it was uncomfortable. This was one of the hardest lessons of all. Other people's emotions were not his responsibility. There were moments when old relationships resurfaced, testing his growth. Someone would reach out after months of silence, acting as if nothing had changed, expecting the same endless availability. Daniel could feel the old version of himself stirring, ready to step back into the familiar role. But now there was a pause. In that pause lived awareness. He asked himself a simple question: do I want this, or am I afraid of losing them? The answer guided him more honestly than fear ever had. With each honest choice, Daniel felt himself becoming more present in his own life. He paid attention to what energized him and what drained him. He stopped forcing himself to attend places where he felt small. He spent more time where he felt calm, even if it meant being alone. Loneliness no longer scared him the way it used to. It had become a quiet space where he could hear his own thoughts clearly, without interruption. He also began to forgive himself for the years he spent ignoring his needs. Instead of calling himself weak or foolish, he recognized that he had been surviving with the tools he had at the time. Compassion replaced self-criticism. He spoke to himself the way he once spoke to others, with patience, understanding, and kindness. This inner shift changed everything. The voice inside his head became softer, more supportive, less demanding. As Daniel grew more rooted in himself, he noticed how his presence affected others. Conversations slowed down. People listened more closely. Some felt safer around him because he no longer tried to rescue or fix them. He simply showed up as himself. Not everyone stayed, but those who did felt real. There was no performance, no silent resentment, no hidden exhaustion behind his kindness. At times, he grieved the version of life he might have lived if he had learned these lessons earlier. But he didn't stay in that grief for long. He understood that awareness arrives when it is meant to. What mattered was not the years behind him, but the honesty ahead of him. Every day he chose himself, he reclaimed a small piece of his life. One quiet evening, Daniel realized something that settled deeply into his bones. Loving yourself above everyone else does not make you less loving. It makes your love cleaner. It removes desperation from your giving and replaces it with choice. It allows you to care without losing yourself, to connect without shrinking, to love without fear of abandonment. As he lay down to rest that night, Daniel felt an unfamiliar steadiness. Not excitement. Not relief. Just peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop running from yourself and finally decide to stay. Daniel had reached a point in his life where the weight of constant self-neglect no longer haunted him. The old patterns. The need to overgive, to over-explain, to constantly seek approval, still appeared occasionally, like shadows at the edge of his vision, but he no longer felt compelled to obey them. Each time the shadows emerged, he recognized them and let them pass without judgment. He had learned that self-love was not a shield to hide behind but a compass to guide him. It showed him what to hold on to and what to release, and in that clarity, he discovered freedom. He started to notice how much energy he had been wasting on worrying about how others perceived him. For decades, he had measured himself through their eyes, believing that his worth was only as strong as their approval. Now, he realized that living for others' validation was like trying to drink from a cup with holes in it. No matter how much he poured in, it was never enough. Only when he focused inward, respecting his own needs and desires, did he feel whole. That simple shift changed everything: his work, his friendships, his sense of purpose. Life no longer felt like a series of obligations but a series of choices he could make consciously, freely, and joyfully. Daniel's interactions with people evolved naturally. He no longer felt obligated to say yes out of fear. He no longer felt guilty when he took time for himself. At first, some people reacted negatively, confused by his newfound boundaries. They had grown used to a version of him that existed solely to please them. Their disappointment stung at first, but Daniel had developed the resilience to let it exist without absorbing it. He understood that the world would always have expectations, but meeting them at the cost of his own happiness was no longer an option. With this mindset, Daniel began to rebuild his sense of purpose. He explored passions he had abandoned years ago. Things that made him feel alive, curious, and fully present. He wrote, he painted, he traveled, he simply observed the world without the constant filter of obligation. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to be guided by what felt meaningful rather than what seemed necessary to gain approval. Each day became a series of intentional choices, each small action a declaration that he valued his own life as much as anyone else's. Daniel also discovered that self-love had a ripple effect on his relationships. Without realizing it, he began to attract people who respected his boundaries and valued him for who he truly was. Conversations became deeper, more honest, more nourishing. He no longer tolerated energy-draining interactions out of fear of conflict or loss. His life became quieter, yes, but the quality of the people and experiences in it improved dramatically. He realized that sometimes, losing certain people is not a loss, it is a release. It makes space for connections that honor your existence rather than exploit it. He had moments of reflection, remembering the years he had spent bending, sacrificing, and erasing himself for the comfort of others. Those memories no longer filled him with shame or regret. Instead, they became lessons etched into his being. They reminded him why he could never return to old patterns. They were proof of how far he had come, evidence that self-love was a journey, not an overnight transformation. Every choice to honor himself reinforced a growing sense of pride and inner strength. As Daniel matured in his understanding, he realized that self-love was not about selfishness or isolation. It was about integrity. It was about refusing to abandon oneself in order to meet the expectations of the world. Loving himself above everyone did not mean closing off from others. It meant entering relationships and situations from a place of authenticity. It meant giving freely, yes, but not at the cost of his own soul. It meant living a life where kindness was not a weapon against his own happiness but a gift shared from fullness, not depletion.